Do you believe that there's a God?
Yes, I do. It's hard to describe. It's just a feeling inside that there must be a superior being.
I believe there's something, like some kind of force out there. I don't know if it's a God, there's a lot of man-made stuff, but I think there's something out there. You can feel it, right? It's in everything.
Do you believe that there is a God?
Yes, I do.
Yes, I think so.
Tell us, what do you think? Is there a God?
No. I don't think there's one specific God. I think it's just like there's something out there. There's not like, I don't know, Jesus. Like some people be like, oh, Jesus is the Son of God and all that stuff. Like I don't think that's specifically it. I just think there is something that no one really knows.
So would that something be a force? Would it be a person? What do you think?
I think more of a force than an actual person.
Okay. Do you believe that there is a God?
Yes, you am.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
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 I just believe in people.
Do you believe that there is a God?
No, I don't.
I just think religion is entirely man-made, and I think it's what we use to overcome our death anxiety.
It's good to be here. Appreciate the invitation to come and share with you folks. Thanks for the nice introduction. I'll tell you the real important thing about myself. Now, the thing you were reading is at least a year old, because my wife and I were coming on our 30th anniversary. And 30 years she's put up with me, and I am married to the most wonderful person in the world. And I have 3 kids. They're all grown. I've got a 27-year-old, a 25-year-old, and a 22-year-old. And 2 grandkids, as was mentioned before. So I'm really blessed. I live in community with some other friends in St. Paul, Minnesota. We all moved out of the suburbs into the city. We live on the same block and share life with one another. And it's just really a good, robust Christian community. So that's kind of the more personal side of me beyond all the academic muckety-muck stuff. So I'm here to talk about tonight why I think there is a God, that God exists. And you could, at this point go into a lot of discussions about various arguments that have been put forth to believe in God. In philosophy, they talk about the design argument or the teleological argument or the cosmological argument or the ontological argument or the anthropic argument. And there's all these different approaches, and I think there's value in all of those. But I think tonight what I'd like to do is kind of share with you how I came to believe in a personal God and the kind of the thought process that I went through. I was raised in a Catholic home, went to a Catholic school, and things of that sort for the first up till about 5th grade, but I just didn't take. I have always said, and it's still true, that I don't have a religious bone in my body. It just doesn't. Religion and me don't get along. And thankfully, I don't think Jesus came to start a religion. And to that degree, I agree with what that gal said. But religion's man-made. The kingdom is not religion. But religion didn't take, and so when my parents divorced at the age of 12, I and my father declared ourselves to be atheists. It turns out he had been an atheist all along. He just pretended to, be a Catholic to appease my stepmother, and he held that up for 10 years. He said he really gave it a good try, but it just, like me, it just didn't take. So I was an atheist. Now, I always had this wonder about death and the purpose of life, and is there life after death, and sometimes I thought there must be something out there that explains everything, but then I thought religion's all just for the weak and things like that. But I was a searching atheist. I got involved in a lot of drugs starting at the age of 13. From the age of 13 to 17, destroyed a lot of brain cells. And for the most part, that was about, having fun and partying. I was a drummer in a rock and roll band, and that's kind of what you did in the late 60s, early 70s. You just did a lot of drugs. But when I did drugs, I was always searching for something else. So I would, this is the time of Timothy Leary, when the psychologist at Harvard who was advocating taking drugs to find ultimate reality. And so we were taking drugs and reading the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and these Eastern mystical books. Well, to make a long story short, I had an experience that I thought was, experiencing nirvana, where I was one with the universe. And the next day I realized, after I'd written all night long on some stuff, I thought at the time it seemed so revelatory. And I read this stuff the next day and it was all just nonsense. I mean, really nonsense. And I came to the conclusion that was the last time I ever did drugs. Even though I was an atheist, I thought there's something evil with drugs. That's not the way to find ultimate reality. Sometime after that, I ended up becoming a Christian. Went to this old Pentecostal church, and something about it just, really gripped me. I was hungry. I was looking for something, and it seemed like these folks had the answer. They had a joy that I didn't have. But that also didn't take. About a year, not even quite a year of that, I went to the University of Minnesota, started college, and it took less than one semester for me to lose my faith. A course in the New Testament, a course in the Old Testament, a little bit of philosophy, boom, my faith was on the rocks. And at this point in my life, I came to the conclusion that if Christianity isn't the truth and the Eastern religions, this mystical thing, isn't the truth, then there isn't any truth. Or if there is, we can't know it. And so I just decided I'm just going to live out this life. And there's really no point in even really thinking about it. Now that was really depressing. The 9 months that I lived as this I went back to my atheism, those were the most miserable 9 months of my life. Because it's one thing to, think that life doesn't have a purpose or a plan or there's no supreme being and no life. If that's what you're used to, you can deal with it. But I had for a year really believed, I had an experience with God that was powerful. I really believed there was a purpose and God loved me and all that. And now to give that up and go back to this atheism, that was painful. I never went back to the hard drugs like I was doing before, but I started to smoke a lot of pot again. But what was really weird is I was so depressed, I couldn't really even get stoned. Or if I did, I'd just get more depressed. I was miserable. I was trying to convince myself that there's no purpose, and so you might as well just have a blast, but I couldn't have a blast. It's really miserable. To the point where, at the end of one philosophy class, I went up to this professor who I had had some dialogues with, and I knew that he was an atheist, and we'd kind of hit it off. And so I went up to him and I said, how do you get up in the morning? Because I'm having trouble. And what I mean is, how do you face the day? How do you get energy to do much of anything? Because everything we strive for comes to nothing. All the dreams that we have come to nothing. All the things that we think we achieve, it comes to nothing. In the end, the scientists tell us the sun will kind of explode and suck in the whole solar system and then turn into a Death Star, a black hole. And eventually all stars will go that way and the universe will just die, it will hit complete equilibrium, and there'll be virtual nothingness, dead matter, sheer blackness. And that will be it. So it doesn't really matter what you strive for, what you try to do, what you accomplish, what you dream of. It all comes to nothing. In the end, it doesn't matter whether you were Adolf Hitler or Mother Teresa. It all comes to nothing. And so I was asking this guy, how do you go on if everything's this pointless? And he stroked his beard for a while. Like this. He goes, well, I've stopped asking that question. But when I was a young man, I used to. And there was a book I read that really gave me a sense of direction and purpose and really kind of defined my existence. It's by Albert Camus. And the book is called The Myth of Sisyphus. I know that sounds like a sexually transmitted disease, but it's actually the name of this legendary Greek hero, a tragic hero. And I went out the next morning and I bought this book, The Myth of Sisyphus, written by this Albert Camus. And I sat down in a restaurant and the whole day just read that book. I went from cover to cover. It's not that thick of a book. And I just blew off my classes and I read this book. Because I was really, pinning a lot on this. If this is what got my professor through, maybe this will get me through. I don't think I would ever commit suicide, but I was thinking about it. I don't know if if it's in me. But I was at the point where for the first time I could actually conceive of the possibility of it, and it made sense. So I sit down in this cafe to read this book. And his first line just grabbed me. He said, suicide, whether we should commit it or not, is really the only important philosophical question. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, you got my attention. Why should we not kill ourselves? Now here's what the book says. He talks about various forms of suicide. He talks about intellectual suicide, and by that he means faith. When people have faith in things that they can't prove, that they're committing intellectual suicide. And then he talks about existential suicide, where people just choose to become shallow and not really reflect on their lives. And both of those he rules out. And then what he advocates is this. The gist of his book is this. He talks about Sisyphus, this Greek hero. And what happened with Sisyphus was that he was murdered and then went to Hades, which was their view of the afterlife. And he there talked to the gods of the underworld, and he said, will you let me go back one day to avenge myself, to take care of my murderer, to have justice done? And the gods said, okay, we'll grant your request, but here's the deal. You can only go one day. You have to return after that day. If you don't, you will be damned to push a giant rock up a hill throughout all eternity. It's a giant boulder. Well, Sisyphus went back, and he avenged his life, but he fell so in love with life and was passionate about life that he could not bring himself to return back to Hades. And so he stayed. Well, this made the gods very, very angry. And so they took his life and they condemned him to push this boulder up this mountain for all eternity. And Albert Camus in this book says this. He is our hero that we should emulate because he chose to live even though it was absurd to do so. Even though he knew the consequences would be eternal damnation, he chose an extra day of life. So also, Albert Camus says, we should, even though life is irrational and it's absurd and we are freaks of nature, it's meaningless, it's pointless, it's painful, and your reason would really tell you it's not worth it, commit suicide. Despite all of that, choose to live like Sisyphus. And the reason is because it's absurd. Defy reason, spit into the wind. Have this heroic character where you refuse to give up. And what he says is that in this act of courage, choosing to live even though there's no point to it, he says we give ourselves some dignity, some worth. It's the kind of worth and kind of dignity that the defiant Sisyphus had. And that's why you should go on. And I read this book in this cafe, and when I put the book down, I thought to myself, if this is the best that the atheists have to offer, I'm in trouble. Because this, frankly, just did not cut it. One of the questions that struck me is if there's no value in the world, because it's all just chemicals and process, it's all just an absurd blob floating in nothingness, if there's no values, then what difference does it make whether you're courageous or a coward? Where'd you get that value from? Dignity, where'd that come from? Integrity, where's he pulling these values out if in fact we live in a valueless universe? Now, I sat there in a very depressed way in this cafe, wondering what I'm going to do with my meaningless life. But something was planted in my brain, a thought. I didn't think it all through the way I'm going to share right now, but the beginnings of it was there in the cafe. That eventually led me to come to the conclusion that there's a personal God, and eventually to work my way back into the Christian faith. But here's what occurred to me or what I began to wonder about in this cafe. I thought to myself, how is it, or why is it, that life is so painful? How is it that I long for life to be meaningful when there is no meaning? And how is it that I long for life to make sense, but it's just an irrational blob floating in the middle of nothingness? And how is it that I have a conviction, and all people have a conviction, that good should overcome evil? We have got moral convictions. How is it we have this intuition that there is a right and wrong if in fact we live in a universe which is devoid of any kind of moral value? Where did we get this stuff from? The stuff that torments us. I began to think this way. Either ultimate reality, whether you call it God or whatever, it's either like us or it's not like us. When I say if it's like us, I mean by that, it's intentional, meaningful, rational, and moral. Or it's not like us. It's just like the atheists believe, like the nihilists believe. Ultimate reality is simply matter. Now, if ultimate reality is simply matter, well, if ultimate reality is like us, personal, that's what I mean by God, a personal ultimate reality, I can now explain why I am the way I am. But if ultimate reality is not like us, it's just matter and motion, how do you explain the fact that we are the way we are? How did a meaningless universe by time and chance evolve beings who long for something the universe can't provide? It struck me. I later found out that C.S. Lewis had an argument like this in his book Mere Christianity, but I hadn't read that. I was just kind of thinking on my own. And here's what struck me. Nature always evolves beings that long for stuff that nature can provide. So, you long for air, and there's air. And you long for food, and there's food. And you get thirsty, and there's water. And we have sex drives, and in appropriate context, there's sex. But wouldn't it be weird if the universe evolved beings that long for stuff that it itself doesn't supply? It's like a craving. One time my wife, when she was pregnant with our second child, woke me up in 1 a.m. She went through a weird, really funky pregnant patch where she was having these bizarre cravings. And at 1 a.m, she wakes me up and she goes, "Honey, you got to go out and get me radishes right now." And she'd never eaten radishes. She had a craving for radishes and peanut butter. So I had to go out and go to every store I could find, and finally found some radishes, brought them home, and she scarfed them all down. Well, okay, fortunately, there's such a thing as radishes. She longs for radishes, and radishes exist. But wouldn't it be weird if all of a sudden you had a craving for radishes, but radishes didn't exist? Like, I'm starving for this thing, but nothing fits it. That would be weird. It's like this. If I went down to the Amazon, and I there found some folks who are polishing skis, and they're making skis, and they're polishing skis, and they keep talking about going skiing, snow skiing. And they're longing for this. They're craving to go skiing. Some so much that for lack of snow, they commit suicide. Now that'd be a little bit weird, wouldn't it? Because it doesn't snow in the Amazon. Never snows in the Amazon. I'd need to explain that. Somehow, some way, these folks came in contact with some snow and had a chance to ski and really liked it. You'd have to explain that. So also, here we are, beings who long for meaning and purpose. And it's beyond just the purpose of doing a good deed here or there. We long for ultimate purpose. I think it's the most fundamental driving force in our life. And people commit suicide sometimes for lack of purpose. How did the universe, if it's sheer matter, by time and chance, evolve a being that longs for something it doesn't supply? Or reason. How is it that we assume, we apply our mind to try to make sense out of things? We assume that the universe has a rational structure to it. But why should we assume that? If, in fact, the ultimate reality is irrational, then our mind is simply the result of some, evolutionary processes and chemicals in motion and things of that sort. Why think the universe as a whole is rational? And yet, if we know anything from science, it's that, in fact, it has a rational structure to it. This is how science was birthed in the late Renaissance period. Is we learned the language of nature, and it's mathematics. Nature has a mathematical structure to it. It's incredible. This is what Einstein used to call the incomprehensible comprehensibility of the universe. It was incomprehensible to him. In fact, this is what ultimately led him to come to a belief in God. It was incomprehensible that we could comprehend the universe. How is it that it has this structure? Do you know that he worked out most of his theory of relativity, in fact, all of it initially, without any kind of empirical verification? He was in a room with blackboards and he would do mathematical equations, and what puzzled him was how is it that he's able to anticipate a discovery out there by doing mathematics in here? The universe has a mind-like quality to it, which, if ultimate reality is rational, you'd expect that, but if ultimate reality is devoid of mind, well then, how do you account for that? And how do you account for the fact that science works? And then there's that moral craving. We have a sense that good should overcome evil, moral intuitions. How did an amoral universe evolve beings that long for good to overcome evil? Now, there's explanations out there, but there's not very good, I don't think. Usually people will say something like, well, look, we're enculturated. We just get socialized into, our views of good and evil, and it's sort of a survival thing. Cultures teach us this. But I submit to you, while there's some truth in that, that doesn't go nearly far enough to explain our fundamental intuitions about evil. When I say that I think that torturing babies is wrong, I'm not simply saying my culture, doesn't like torturing babies. I'm saying it is objectively wrong, and so is everybody else who would say that. I was debating an atheist one time at the University of Minnesota, and we were arguing about this, and I said to him, okay, because he's a cultural relativist, doesn't believe there's any objective good or evil. So I said to him, so you're telling me if Hitler would have won the war and we were all Nazis, it would be a good thing that all the Jews were exterminated? Because everyone would believe that. Now, I got him in a bind here because it's at a college, and it's not going to be very politically correct for him to say yes, but his system won't allow him to say no. And so his response was, well, Hitler didn't win the war. That's a stupid question. I said, well, he could have won the war. And if he had, you have to say that it would be a good thing that all the Jews were exterminated, because that's what the whole world would believe. And then his response was to say he couldn't have won the war. And it's like, well, where do you get this metaphysical principle of optimism from? And bad guys sometimes win, it works that way. There was a professor I had once who was this cultural anthropologist and a cultural relativist, and really hammered this home a lot, that she was really mad at missionaries who take their Western values and impose them on these, third world countries and these primordial groups. And so she was always, talking about how the beauty of these primordial cultures and how they, have these traditions that we may think are barbaric, but we shouldn't try to tamper with them and things of that sort. I found out later on that she was part of the first conference to China in the late 80s or early 90s that was advocating on the United Nations to have universal standards for the treatment of women. Just like we have them for justice and the treatment of political prisoners or whatever, we ought to have a universal standard for the treatment of women so that those countries who don't have at least meet a minimal standard of decency in their treatment of women, which was most Muslim countries, that they would suffer some consequences for that. The United Nations would put pressure on them. Now, I agree with her. I think that'd be a great thing to have. What I'm wondering is, where does she get that from? Where did that come from? They were really opposed to the barbaric practice of female circumcision, which still goes on in some parts of Africa. It's just barbaric. It's just barbaric. I've dealt with people who have gone through that, and it's all for the purpose of enhancing male control, and it's barbaric. So I'd like to have a standard against that. But that's because I believe that there are objective standards. But if you're a cultural relativist, how can you possibly say that it's wrong for them to practice female circumcision or anything else? They've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. Who are you, Miss High and Mighty Westerner, to go in there with your superior mindset, just like the old missionaries, and impose your subjective preferences on these ancient cultures? The point is this. People can, in terms of their philosophy, claim that they're relativists, but no one lives like that. No one really, unless there's something wrong with you, we all assume that our basic moral intuitions are objective. They're out there. There's something that answers to them. And I mean, if you don't believe that, if someone tells you they're relativists, just take up their parking space and see how relative they are then. When they say that's wrong, we mean you violated something in the universe. And the question we got to ask ourselves is this. What grounds those moral intuitions? And what grounds our trust in reason? And what grounds our longing for meaning? Now, I came to believe this, that if ultimate reality is like me, in some way, far more transcendent, of course, than is a super example, super instance of meaning and rationality and purpose and morality. But I reflect ultimate reality. If that's true, well, now I can explain why I am the way I am and why I have the longings I have. And life makes sense. And I found out there's an answer to the longings that are there. There's a fulfillment as you enter into a relationship with this personal God. In fact, I've come to believe that the reason we have those longings is like a homing device to drive us into a relationship with Him. It's His way of always saying, come home, come home, come home. But if ultimate reality is not at all like me, well, then we are just absurd creatures, like Albert Camus said, just absurd. You can't explain anything about reality, and you can't even explain why you want to explain anything about reality, because all your reasoning is simply chemicals popping in your head, which can't really be the basis for any kind of truth value. Life can't be explained, and it's very, very painful, because you live your life, well, at best like Sisyphus. We are like, if reality is ultimately irrational, amoral, and meaningless, we're like fish that evolved in the middle of the Sahara Desert. As the wind was pushing the sand around, and somehow, whoosh, there we are. And we spend our short, miserable existence trying to, find some water, flopping in the hot sun, saying, where's the water, where's the water, where's the water? The thing is, there ain't no water in the Sahara. Never has been any water in the Sahara. And we're absurd fish for thinking that there should be water in the Sahara. But here we are. We're freaks of nature, and Albert Camus says that. We're freaks of nature who long for things the universe doesn't supply. I submit to you, I came to the conclusion that a more reasonable way of looking at things is to assume that the ultimate reality is something like me, that I'm a little image of that. The way the Bible says it is that we are made in the image of God. And the reason we have the fundamental longings that we have is because the God who created us has those things. He is the supreme example of meaning, rationality, and morality. So I ended up recommitting, or at least searching for God, looking for, continuing to search, and finally came to the conviction that there must be a personal God out there, which then led me to the question, well, then if He created me on purpose, then where might He be communicating with me? But that's a different topic altogether. Okay, you want to talk a little bit, have a little dialogue up here?
You've really given us a lot to think about there, Greg. I think he deserves a big hand for that. What do you say?
Oh, thanks.
Well, we did promise that this would be a dialogue about God. And so we're giving everybody the opportunity here to just raise questions, even raise objections. And so at this time, we have somebody here with a roving mic. And for those of you who may not feel very comfortable standing up and speaking into a mic, we have these response cards in the pews in front of you. And so we're just going to invite you to take it. And if you'd like to ask a question right now, just write it down. You can use the back of the card if you need extra space. And we have somebody going around. Just put your card up, and they'll come and collect your card. And we can then process the questions. We'll put it up on the screen. And then Greg will be able to answer. And remember, it's not just questions, it's comments as well. So who would like to be the first? Don't all rush to the mic or anything.
Come on down.
Alex.
Yes, sir. Tell us your name, too.
Yeah. My name is Alex Vladar, and
Hello,
I
Alex.
wanted to ask Dr. Boyd on my when I make approach to in public, and I want to point to God, I mention my opinion, my belief that that we are very fortunate. This world is not run by General Motors or Ford Motor Company. Would you
Amen to that
approve
one.
or approach like that?
Amen to that. I mean, it's, but that kind of gets into the problem of evil that we'll talk about more tomorrow, because there are people who say, look, if there is a supreme intelligence and personal being running this thing, why wouldn't he do a better job? And sometimes, frankly, the world looks like it's run by AIG or General Motors or whoever. It looks like it's poorly managed. But that's a question we'll have to deal with tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Is there anybody who's filled out a card? Perhaps you don't like coming to the mic. If you filled out a card, have a question or comment, please feel free. Nobody's standing up yet.
Questions of Sisyphus, personal God, anything you want. There's got to be some kind of questions out there. Pondering, or you could say, what did you mean when you said incomprehensible comprehensibility, or something like that?
What about some of the questions that were raised in that video earlier? Like those girls who were saying, for example, one of them was saying, yeah, I don't believe that there's a God at all. I believe religion is just man-made. The other one said, well, I believe that there is a God, but that God's not a person. That God's a force.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit more
Sure.
on that?
I mean, that's kind of where I was at in my earlier kind of drug days. There's a belief that there's some kind of, maybe a mystical something out there, but not a personal God or anything that you'd have a relationship with. It's sort of, you're just looking for the ultimate explanation. There must be some kind of thing to explain this. And that's a good start, I think. I mean, to have this, a sense that the world doesn't explain itself. It's really interesting that especially in the last 30 years in science, there's been a number of indications pointing to the need for some kind of transcendent explanation for things. For example, the whole Big Bang Theory is right now, it's getting funkier all the time, but the idea is that the universe is expanding, and if we take it and kind of run the film backwards, we go back about 14 billion years to this microscopic dot, okay? And so I don't care what you think about that, but this is kind of the dominant view of science out there right now. And then it exploded. And so we're all the results of this giant explosion 14 billion years ago. Well, what's interesting is that this looks like a one-time event. It's not that like there's not enough matter in the universe to create the gravity that's sufficient to slow down this expansion and eventually retract that. They used to think that that must be the case. But now they're saying that there's far too little matter to create the gravity sufficient to pull this back. In fact, they just found out, I think it was 4 years ago, that the farther out they go, with the super telescopes they have now, the faster things are going. Not only is the universe not slowing down, it's actually speeding up in its expansion, and they have no explanation for that. So here's the thing. This is a one-time shot. And if we know anything about matter, it's or energy, is that it runs out. I mean, things wind down. The second law of thermodynamics, the amount of usable energy is running out. So eventually this universe will run out. That means that it's not eternal. And it doesn't explain itself. Why did it pop once and all of a sudden it comes into being and then it goes out of existence? It's not self-explanatory. And so it seems like, another way of looking at it is this. Something's got to be eternal. Because unless you think that something comes from nothing, then if there's something, there must have always been something. Think about it. And apparently there is something because I'm talking to you right now, so there must have always been something. And that something is the explanation for the fact that I can right now be talking to you. But matter isn't a very good candidate for that. In fact, it's a very terrible candidate because it's not the kind of thing that lasts forever. Whatever is eternal has to, I think, be non-material and have a self-existence that doesn't come into being or go out of being. I hope that was not too confusing.
Okay. Well, you know, there's a question that's popped up on the screen
good.
here. It says, it seems to me that God could cure atheism in a second by just showing up. Why doesn't he?
Why doesn't he do that? Good question. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But what people want is sort of, my dad asked this question, and I had a series of correspondence with him. It's in a book, Letters from a Skeptic, which is back on the table. He was an atheist, and we argued for 3 years over matters of the faith. But I'd say two things about that. Two things. One is, in some ways, God tried the more direct approach in the Old Testament. You know, he kind of shows up in a cloud in the sky and things of that sort. And those make a momentary impression on people, but they don't last very long. It doesn't, the heart isn't changed by those impressive displays. You know, so the Israelites would always like, whoa, God's here, we're going to walk in obedience. But within a couple months or a year or so, they're back to their old ways. A second thing is that it's almost always possible to explain things another way. Even when God shows up in fantastic ways, you know, there's other ways of looking at it. You know, there's an account where the Father spoke from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." Did it in public. Everyone was there, heard it. But the Pharisees, they go, "Did it just thunder?" That's the strangest sounding thunder I've ever heard. Or, you know, someone gets really, you know, incredibly healed. The doctors, they don't know what to do with that kind of stuff, so they just say, oh, it was a spontaneous remission. I prayed with a guy one time who had a spontaneous remission overnight and had brain cancer go away. That's a pretty impressive spontaneous remission. But there's always other ways of explaining it, even if it's just with a phrase like spontaneous remission. But the most important thing I'd say about the why doesn't God just show up kind of question is this. For us to be able to make choices responsibly, there has to be, God's presence to us has to be non-coercive. If God showed up like a giant head on the Wizard of Oz, we'd, you know, probably, most of us would fall on the ground, or most people on the planet would like, oh, we worship you, please don't boil us and don't fry us and whatever. But see, that's like putting a gun to a person's head and said, will you believe in me? Will you love me? You know, you could win the argument that way. God could convince all the atheists. But that wouldn't do a thing to change their heart. What God wants is not simply some kind of coerced assent, like a checkmate. He could do that if he wanted, but what he wants is love. And love requires free will. And that means there has to be enough clarity for us. Those who want to see, you have enough reasons to see. But those who don't want to see, there's enough ambiguity that you don't have to see. And that's why faith is really a moral act. It's not just a matter of intellectual assent or dissent. Our heart's involved in this. And so there's sort of a necessary ambiguity to the world if, in fact, what God wants is a free choice in the direction of love.
So what you're saying then is faith is not just an emotional thing. You're saying it is, but it has to be more than emotional. There has to be some evident component as well.
Well, not necessarily. It's because for some people, they just kind of sense in their heart that this is true, and they commit to it. There's other people who need a lot of evidence, and I'm kind of in that camp. You know, faith never comes easy for me. Mm-hmm. Other people, it's just kind of, to them it's obvious that God exists. But what faith isn't is simply, you know, a checkmate. Like if you and I were having a logical argument, I might get to the point where I actually prove that you're wrong, and you go, you win. You know, checkmate. Okay, you proved your case. And that's fine if you're just talking about, you know, an intellectual argument. But I can't argue into a relationship with me. You know, I might prove that I exist to you, but that doesn't do anything to get a relationship here. That's on its own kind of an intellectually coercive thing. If there's going to be a free choice for or against God, we have to have the ability to not see him if we don't want to see him, and to create an alternative scenario in our mind, to be lords of our own life, and to go our own direction, which ultimately is destruction. So it's about free will.
It's all about free will.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that a whole lot more. We do have one more question, and then we're going to take a break after this one. Yes?
This is sort of a two-part question. First of all, if there's enough evidence, and I believe there is, to logically prove the existence of a personal God, then why are there atheists? And the second part of the question is, how has the Christian church done at addressing non-belief, and how have they done at convincing atheists that there is a personal God, and why have they failed so miserably?
Very good question. Good question. The reason there's atheists is because, as I said before, I think there are good arguments for the existence of God, but there's always other ways of looking at things. The arguments are non-coercive. I actually think there is one argument that is a logical certainty, but it's called the ontological argument. But even there, there's ways around it. And it's a very complex argument, so I don't use it very much. But on the whole, it's not coercive. It ultimately comes down to a free choice. I think there is sufficient evidence for the existence of God if you have the kind of heart that's open to believing and submitting. But there's enough ambiguity so that you don't have to submit. And that's why it's about free will. For most atheists, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but when I was an atheist, one of the major arguments was just the massive existence of evil. It's like how, and to this day, I'll be honest, when I hear about some of the utterly nightmarish, unthinkable, terrible things that happens to people, and not always just human on human, but sometimes nature can be just vicious with parasites and mudslides and volcanoes, and you look at that and you go, how could an all-good, all-loving God allow that? And I think there's an answer to that, but I can understand how someone might say, well, your answer isn't good enough, especially if they themselves have been the victim of evil and pain. And so there's enough ambiguity. I honestly think that most atheists, like my father, in the book Letters from a Skeptic, in the 12th letter, we were talking about prayer, and he brought up something that really changed the kind of the texture of our dialogue. He asked the question, if prayer works, then why did your mother die? My mom died when I was 2. And he says, we prayed, you kids prayed all the time, because your grandmother was a praying woman and blah, 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 and why didn't God answer that prayer? He had a great chance right there. And what I said in response was not, at that point I didn't want to give an intellectual answer, because what was going on there is he's letting out a little bit of a wound. I think that, I can't say all, but at least many, maybe most atheists, it's not so much that they don't believe in God, they're just really disappointed and really mad. And very, very often, in fact, I'm almost inclined to say always, I have yet to find an exception to this principle. But most of the time, the God that they're rejecting is a God that I think is very rejectable. If I believed what they believe about God, I think I'd be an atheist too. I'm just very glad that I found a very, very different picture of God. One that, if a person has the right picture of God, one that looks like Jesus, they might still decide to be an atheist, but they ought to really miss it. It's like they ought to wish it was true, rather than, as many people do, they feel they have to reject God just to give humans some dignity and some free will and some things like that.
Right on. Well, thanks so much for that explanation. That is just, we're going to just take a time for a break now. I'm sure you got tons of questions now that things have gotten started. Right on. Write them down. We're going to save these, and there's going to be, tomorrow afternoon, there's going to be a whole panel discussion, and some of these questions that you write down will be brought back for discussion then. What you just raised right now is fantastic for dovetailing into the next talk that's going to be given to us by Marco Belmonte, and that is, if there is a God, what do I expect from this God?